Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, happy Father's Day again. No doubt today's gospel came to mind for you on a day set aside to celebrate family. Or perhaps not. As you know, I generally stick with assigned texts for the day, and I see it as a challenge when some of the difficult ones come up. I'll have quite a bit to say about this in a few minutes. But last week I did some continuing education. For those of you who don't know, St. Olaf College in Northfield is home to the largest library dedicated to Søren Kierkegaard outside of Denmark, where he lived and worked in the early to mid 1800s. You've heard me occasionally reference Kierkegaard as a Lutheran theologian and philosopher who is considered the father of existentialism. This past week, St. Olaf hosted a conference for Kierkegaard scholars, but it was open to others, including stray pastors who wanted to wander in. Despite attending St. Olaf, I never took a class on the subject, and I had wanted for years to deepen my understanding given how close the library is. Scholars from all over the world came. It's a testament to how broad his appeal and impact has been, both across theology and philosophy. And it's an interest that is continuing to grow, especially on other continents. I was a bit humbled, and I just kind of hid out in the corner, not quite literally. But I had a couple of conversations, and I listened to 36 scholars present their papers, the academic equivalent of TED Talks. Søren Kierkegaard, or Kierkegaard, as it's often pronounced as well, was deeply impacted by his own father, Michael, who was quite poor growing up. His father was born into a family of indentured servant laborers in rural Denmark with ties to the local parish priest. In exchange for labor, the church allowed Michael's family to use a small plot of the church's property called a gard. This is where the family name comes from. Kirke is a church. Gard usually refers to a yard or cemetery in the context of a church. So our famous theologian and philosopher is Søren Churchyard. Maybe it was because of the cemetery that he spent so much time around that his father Michael was known to be very melancholy and stern. Søren was the youngest of 7 children, and yet 5 of his siblings died fairly young. And in part because of Søren's experience of his father and the death of siblings and the early death of his mother, Søren felt a need to leave. He resisted the expectations of his father in his personal and early academic life. He relished his freedom and left his father behind as he spent time in Berlin. But just prior to his father's death, he came back to Copenhagen and reconciled with him at age 25. I think it's safe to say that if Søren hadn't left home and explored opportunities elsewhere, he may not have discovered his calling and passion. I share that story because on a day like Father's Day, perhaps your own relationship with your father or another family member has evolved in a less than expected way. Perhaps there have been times of deep connection, but also time apart, whether chosen or not. Søren appreciated his father's impact on him for the rest of his life, and even if he didn't have the chance to fully share that with him. Today's gospel from Matthew has some timeless words of assurance. Perhaps the most remembered are verses 29 through 31. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground apart from your Father, and even the hairs of your head are all counted. So do not be afraid. You are of more value than many sparrows. In short, if God cares about sparrows, even though the world sees them as a commodity, know that God cares even more about you as a child of God. But as you heard earlier, the passage as a whole is a little difficult, challenging family relationships, especially when we want to raise up the gift and value of family. So what are we supposed to do with this? Again, Jesus says in Matthew 10, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father." Again, happy Father's Day. "And a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, and one's foes will be members of one's own household." I mean, it's a bit unsettling. On the surface, it sounds maybe irrational and somehow just wrong. And this is coming from Jesus? Martin Luther famously didn't appreciate certain passages and books in the Bible, like James. At one time, he considered removing James from his translation of the New Testament. He later changed his mind, though. But do we do that with this passage? Is there any value in it at all? Maybe it's just best to disregard it. Let's take a moment to unpack it and first be sure about what Jesus is really saying here. Again, he says, "Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace but a sword." Some might point to this and say, see, Jesus clearly wasn't a pacifist. But while you can find various references to literal swords in the New Testament, there are notable uses of it as a metaphor. Hebrews 4:12 says, "The word of God is living and active and sharper than any two-edged sword." And the book of Revelation repeatedly talks about how the rulers of the world use literal swords, but in response, the sword used by Jesus is the word of God. So please hear that when Jesus says, "I have come not to bring peace, but a sword." In fact, if it wasn't clear enough, we know that on the sole occasion that one of his disciples used a sword to fight the soldiers coming to arrest Jesus, Jesus told him to put it away. It's his word and message, not a literal weapon, that causes division in this passage. Okay. But that's still not a warm, fuzzy message, right? I have come not to bring peace, but a word that will divide. Shouldn't the message of Jesus bring families together rather than cause division? It can. But here's where we need to understand the social context of this passage. In the early days of Christian faith, disciples were being thrown out of their communities. Being part of the community, your clan, and your family was a critical part of your identity and survival. We have passages that even talk about some of the tension between Jesus and his own family and the community that he grew up in. Something about this new way of life and movement Jesus started caused some disruption in families and communities. We can understand this in the sense that anything new or perceived as other usually causes some disruption. But beyond that, the central message of Jesus that we should love and care for our neighbor, even foreigners and people of other faiths, is jarring when you believe your primary loyalty is to take care of your own. Family should continue to be a place of trust and love with those closest to us. But if the family or group you're with requires you to love only those inside the circle or above everyone else at the expense of others and not your neighbor or the stranger, then this ultimately clashes with Jesus and his teachings. When a family, tribe, or narrow religious sect is your only circle of trust and loyalty, then within that mindset, you really don't owe the people outside of that circle much of anything. At best, they get what's left over. But Jesus teaches a different ethic. He asks us to expand our circle. In fact, the call to love your neighbor and ultimately the foreigner and adversary provides an important part of the foundation of modern nation states and democracies, and even much of the international order we've known for the last several decades. Even if you disagree with someone, you agree to extend human dignity and shared rights to them. Life is not simply about what's good for my family or my tribe or whatever group we identify with, but it's about what's good for all people in a larger sphere. Many of us may take this wider circle of commitment and care for granted, but we have to remember that as we can see in the time of Jesus, this is outside of the norm in human history. Some today, in fact, directly argue against this commitment to a wider circle of commitment to neighbors and foreigners not like us. Much of human history was organized and governed by families, tribes, and clans, and we can see this rule by family in the case of royalty and clans, and in less official ways in cases of nepotism and even mafia. When implications of loving all of our neighbors comes front and center, there's often a pull back to family and tribe as the organizing principle for the social order. It seems to offer a simpler and purer life, not imposed upon by other peoples and their foreign values. Of course, this ignores all the ways that narrower and narrower groups will still find endless ways to fight amongst themselves, as well as with other outside groups. Again, in the course of widening the circle, Jesus calls his followers to love God and love their neighbor, and notice that loving God, according to Jesus, is not an exclusive arrangement. In fact, God hopes that we will love our neighbor as well. He wants to share the circle of love. One of Kierkegaard's most influential books was called Either Or. In that book and others, a central theme that emerges in Kierkegaard's writings is that each one of us is an individual that stands before God, whether we see that now or not. We individually are accountable for our choices and decisions. While there is important value in community and belonging, we cannot use the cover of a group, a tribe, a family, or a party to excuse our own actions. We would like to say that we can follow our proverbial family and God. We would like a world that is always both and, not either or, but we all understand that our choices, whether conscious or not, do take us down particular roads. Perhaps both and is possible at various times, but we don't have to imagine that the groups we identify with are flawed to see that we must choose our own individual path at times. To pursue our highest calling and purpose can require us to make a singular choice. In Matthew 8, Jesus is inviting a crowd to come with him, and one follower says, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus said to him, "Follow me and let the dead bury their own dead." It sounds disrespectful. It sounds very either or, doesn't it? But it's helpful to know there was a standard grieving process that lasted a year. And so Jesus was not making an unrealistic demand. It was simply a statement of fact. Jesus is physically moving on, and his time is short. Either the man follows Jesus or he will not. The opportunity will pass. It's not that we have to look for ways to separate from anyone, and certainly not in a contentious manner for our part, nor need it be permanent. Kierkegaard himself returned to his father, but if we are to pursue the good or follow our callings, what will we do? I've thought about this myself as a father. What is my greatest desire for my own kids? Certainly I want to be close to them for the rest of my life, but neither would I want to get in the way of them pursuing their own calling or sense of purpose if that requires them to move away or be out of regular contact. In fact, seeing them pursue their calling and a higher purpose that cares for the needs of others would bring me joy. In this series, we're exploring the ways that Jesus and his teachings give rise to a wider and healthier community. Today's gospel seems to speak negatively about family relationships, but it's not encouragement to create division, nor is it approval to leave behind our commitments to love and care for our family. Jesus actually has positive things to say elsewhere about loving family members and all people, and we see him speak to his own mother in John 19, where he looks after her needs even in his final moments from the cross. What Jesus does in today's gospel is speak to his own followers in realistic terms about the real choices they will face if they do follow him, given their social circumstances. They will face some who demand that they give loyalty to a narrower circle, family above all. Never go against the family. Many of the disciples would confront these either-or decisions. Each of them would ultimately need to decide for themselves if this vision of a wider circle of loving neighbor and living selflessly would be worth their life commitment or not. Their own families in that traditional Hebraic culture would no doubt ask them to stay and contribute to their smaller circle. This isn't an inherently bad thing, but it is a different thing. Francis Fukuyama is a political scientist, historian, and the son of a minister. In his 2-volume book on the origins of political order, which I've referenced before, he explains that traditional cultures based on social groups like tribes and clans create a high degree of trust within the inner circle. But there's a high degree of distrust and lower moral standards than towards strangers. In other words, high integrity and loyalty to family, but when it comes to outsiders, anything goes. This matters when one of these singular groups assumes a place of authority over a wider sphere, such as a nation. Fukuyama explains that strangers fall into a different category than kin. A lower standard of moral behavior applies when someone becomes, for example, a public official. This provides cultural reinforcement for corruption. In such societies, one feels entitled to steal on behalf of one's family. To reassert the primacy of family and clans over the wider neighbor and the good of the whole may sound positive on the surface, but you can see the ways that this way of organizing around narrower circles runs counter to a pluralistic and democratic society that so many of us have been accustomed to. The problem that I think Fukuyama identifies and that Jesus also identified 2,000 years ago is not that it's wrong to be committed to your family or to love your family or whatever group you associate with. Once again, Jesus teaches love and love for both neighbor and family. But we are confronted with a choice in the long history of humanity's conflict, greed, and group tensions. Each of us must answer how we will respond to the call of Jesus, regardless of how our lives or society are structured. Either we embrace a wider sphere and the ethic of love for neighbor and stranger, or we will be drawn to leave it behind. To choose Jesus is to embrace a wider circle and a shared humanity. We can't personally and directly love all of humanity, but we can support the effort, and we can choose how we will respond to those who come into our life each day. This is not an easy path. It may cause some ties to be severed where paths diverge. But Jesus has a final assurance for those who follow this larger and more generous vision. Those who lose their life for my sake will find it. Amen. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.